Hi, my name is Stephanie Skora. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am an alumna of the university. I graduated in 2016. Boo Illini. I am currently the president of the board of directors of the Up Center of Champaign County, which is the local LGBT resource center, and I do a lot of stuff with everybody around here for a lot of reasons. Well, so I do this thing where I cover electoral politics on Facebook for people who can't be bothered to cover electoral politics for themselves, and also who don't want to put up with covering electoral politics for themselves, and don't want to trust mainstream media's interpretation of, what's going on and who's doing what. And so I was actually watching the election start to finish from about 2 hours before the first ballots were cast to the minute that they called the election and sometime afterwards. I was on my couch with my wife in our living room, in our apartment, and we were just watching the whole thing. I knew that Trump was going to win. I knew that Trump was going to win the Republican nomination from the minute he came down that escalator in July, gave a really racist speech, and polled at 28% immediately. Because you don't do that. Like, in a Republican you're generally the rules in the Republican primary are be as racist as you can without being explicitly racist. Hate gay people as much as you can. Be as, say Jesus the most amount of times. And, say that you won't tax rich people. And Trump comes down this elevator and gives this horrendous speech about how terrible Mexicans are and how much he hates Muslims. And he polls at 28%. And at that moment I was like, shit, this guy's going to win the nomination. And I did not think that he was going to beat Hillary Clinton because it took the combined effort of white people being the worst thing ever and Hillary Clinton running a very poorly run campaign to get Donald Trump that victory. A large part of it was white people fucked up really bad, and we voted for a guy who isn't going to actually do shit for us, but we voted for him because white people are racist as hell. And we voted for the racist guy. Pretty straightforward. But at the same time, Hillary Clinton did not make any effort to attract the voters that Bernie Sanders attracted during the primaries, which was a problem in her campaign, where she didn't do everything to keep all the Democratic votes Democratic. She just focused on her base and didn't focus on the larger base of the Democratic Party. She also replicated the Republican primary candidates' strategy of talking about how terrible Trump is as a candidate and how he couldn't possibly win the election and how he couldn't possibly, lead the country. And she failed to pay attention to the fact that, when Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and Chris Christie and, less Chris Christie than the others, but, Ben Carson and John Kasich and Jeb and all those folks were down to the last 8 or 7 people in the Republican primary, and they all decided to start attacking Trump to try to get him out of the race because he was polling really well and winning some states. They all started talking about how terrible of a candidate he was, how he couldn't possibly run the government, how unqualified he was, how terrible the things he was saying were, and they all got their butts kicked. And they all got their butts kicked really, really badly in a lot of really embarrassing ways for them. Like, Marco Rubio didn't even win Florida from Donald Trump. Donald Trump kicked his ass in Florida. And that's when Marco Rubio dropped out of the race and said he would retire to private life, and then came back and ran for Senate and won his Senate seat. But what Hillary Clinton did was she replicated that exact strategy of talk about how terrible Trump is in the hopes that people will realize Trump is terrible and not vote for him. And she didn't pay attention to the fact that 7 other people had already tried to do that, and it didn't work for any of them. And they were all shellacked and beaten terribly because the people who were voting for Trump, racist white people, don't care how terrible he is, because racist white people love that he's terrible. They're voting for the terrible. And the other people who are, low-key racist white people, who are I'm not racist, I just want black people to leave, and I want my jobs. And blah blah Mexicans, blah blah Muslims, blah blah people who have any drops of melanin in them whatsoever. Those white people will never pay attention to the fact that Trump is terrible, because all they want is somebody who will be conservatively economic, or economically conservative, or whatever the fuck they want. And so Hillary Clinton replicated the Republican candidate's primary strategy and got her ass kicked. And, results pending the recount. And I do believe that there was a possibility of Russian-based electoral fraud. And if Hillary Clinton winds up getting the presidency, okay, we're all still fucked, but we're all fucked in really different ways. rather than dealing with a terrible fascist in the army of the KKK and neo-Nazis like being out in public. We'll still have to deal with that, because they'll be really mad that their candidate didn't win, even though he technically won. But we'll also have to deal with really awful neoliberalism. But at least we know how to fight neoliberalism, right? We haven't had a lot of experience with fascists lately, at least running government. But, my reaction was a mixture between shock and horror and disbelief that it actually happened, and shock and horror and disbelief that I didn't expect it to happen anyway. Because never underestimate the stupidity of white people and the strength of white supremacy. And also never underestimate the ability of, hoity-toity neoliberal richy-rich politicians to completely botch a campaign that they have no business losing. Well, we're all kind of totally boned. Trans people in particular, we're sort of waiting to see. We're all anticipating that we're completely screwed. Because we are likely going to be completely screwed, because Trump's vice president, Mike Pence, believes that if he electrocutes queer and trans people enough, we'll suddenly be perfectly happy cis-hets and go on to have perfectly happy heterosexual cisgender marriages. It doesn't work like that. I don't know where Mike Pence learned anything, but he certainly, none of his beliefs are accurate or humane in any way. Mike Pence is a terrible person. And as we said during our March for Trans Day of Remembrance, fuck Mike Pence, he ain't worth 2 cents. So, we're all just kind of waiting to see in which ways we're going to be screwed. There was a lot of panic that, somehow gay marriage would get overturned and the Obergefell decision would be reversed by the Supreme Court. That doesn't seem like it's likely to happen. So cis gay folks are okay-ish. Cis gay men are fine. They've always been fine, they'll always be fine. White cis gay men, for the most part, are going to be perfectly happy doing exactly the same thing that they've always done, which is not care about the rest of us. Gay men of color are screwed because they're people of color, and we've all seen what happens in the immediate aftermath of Trump's election, where hate crimes just skyrocketed, particularly racially motivated hate crimes. But for trans folks in general, both white trans people and trans people of color, we've sort of been waiting to figure out which ways we're going to be screwed and taking action against that. People have started rushing to get identitary documents, particularly passports, because the rules governing affirming genders and names on passports are likely to change. But other than that, it really varies state by state, except for the Affordable Care Act provisions. A lot of trans folks rely on getting their hormones and sometimes coverage for gender confirmation surgery because of provisions in the Affordable Care Act. Is this thing called Article 1557, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender and sexuality in the Affordable Care Act, and that's how trans folks have been getting most of our medical care for the last several years. It's saying, it's illegal to discriminate against us because we're trans. And we're waiting to see whether that goes away or not. We're anticipating that it will. And basically what we're doing right now is saying, we're assuming that we're going to start from square -5, where all the protections that we enjoy currently will, be stripped away, and there'll be a whole bunch of negative laws passed, and those of us who live in states with good state laws will be in better positions than those of us who aren't. But it's very panic and also wait and see. But a lot of queer and trans people have, for the first time in their lives, started saying, thank God for states' rights. And we never thought that we would start saying that. But for example, in Illinois, if the Affordable Care Act completely goes away, if the federal government tries to make some sort of homophobic and transphobic regulatory interpretation regarding affirming identitary measures for passports, if there's some sort of nationwide decree that conversion therapy is okay. Illinois has a lot of really good laws. Healthcare discrimination is illegal in Illinois. Employment discrimination is illegal in Illinois, etc., etc. And so we'll be less screwed because we live in a state with good laws. Now, for example, people who live one state over in Indiana will be completely fucked because their state has horrible laws because Mike Pence was their governor. And they're not likely to get a better replacement than Mike Pence. Although it'll be interesting to see who they end up with. Probably the lieutenant governor. I don't know who that is, but they're probably terrible. But, on campus, for example, Professor Toby Beecham has started raising money and raised a whole bunch of money to get to fund trans folks' identity document changes nationally. And people have started doing that and having pop-up clinics for name and gender and ID changes, and just sort of asking cis folks to hoard medication that's estrogen or testosterone based, so that when we get cut off from our hormones, we can still medicate. And just, we've sort of gone into full survival mode, full, guerrilla survival mode. And right now it's, stockpile and prepare and expect the worst and anticipate the worst, but wait and see. And that sucks, because before, under neoliberalism, we were dying at atrocious rates and experiencing incremental positive change. Now we're likely to die at even more atrocious rates, and incremental positive change will mostly be stopped. And, it's sort of a shit soup whichever way you turn it, but one of them has more turds. Before, people have been embracing, nonviolence and peaceful protest, and et cetera, et cetera. Now we're up against a government that was elected by neo-Nazis and the KKK and straight-up fascists, people who would like nothing better than to shoot us and beat our brains out, just because we are who we are. And so basically the solution is to beat their brains out before they can beat our brains out. Don't let Nazis exist safely in your community spaces or in your community at all. If you see some guy screaming at people on the street, punch him in the face. And when the cops show up to arrest you, punch them in the face too. Because, the law, their laws will never protect us. Their laws never have protected us. Their laws definitely won't protect us now. And so what's going to protect us is the strength of our community and our strength in numbers. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to fight back, and we're going to have to fight back hard. Because appealing to the morality of, Klansmen isn't going to work, because the morality of Klansmen is that we should all be dead for being, brown or trans or queer or Muslim or, not a Jesus-loving, hood-wearing, southern, cisgender, heterosexual white man named, Joe or something. Or Greg. Or David. But, no quarter, no peace for fascists. No quarter, no peace for neo-Nazis. No quarter, no peace for Klansmen. Make them feel so afraid and so unsafe to show their faces and show their hate that they go back underground. And teach them that, just because Donald Trump got elected in an election where they showed up and voted, and a whole bunch of white people fucked up really bad and were really, really racist and showed up and voted, doesn't mean that those white people are going to have an easy time oppressing us. Doesn't mean that those straight cis people are going to have an easy time oppressing us. Doesn't mean that those quote-unquote Christians are going to have an easy time oppressing us. We're going to make this shit as hard for them as we possibly can, and if that involves violence, then that involves violence, because we sure as hell know that their side is not going to be peaceful when they're trying to take away our rights. And so we have to fight tooth, nail, club, and foot for every ounce of ground we've got, and not let them take anything away from us. Well, so love definitely has a place as a primary means of resistance. The role of love as a primary means of resistance is intra-community. We all have to love each other and respect each other and work as damn hard as we can to make sure we, as a group of people who are in solidarity and community with each other, are loved and safe and respected and have all the things that we need. We need to love each other. We should not ever love the people opposing us trying to take away our rights. They do not deserve love from anybody. They do not deserve peace from anybody, because if we ask them to love and respect us, they sure as hell aren't going to do it, and we gain no advantage from being on a moral high ground while they kill us. Moral high ground doesn't do you any good when you're being shot in the face by a Nazi. You don't get to die saying, well, at least I was a peaceful protester. It doesn't work. Peace, love, and kumbaya protests don't work against fascism. The only thing that fascism understands is, organized, militant resistance. because fascism is organized and militant and violent, and they're not gonna ask politely to take away our rights. They're gonna come and they're gonna beat us up, and they're gonna pass legislation, and they're gonna do everything that they can to make our lives a living hell. And what we have to do is go right back at them, because and while we're doing that, we have to love each other and take care of each other and make sure that we are able in our communities to take on and carry on this fight. And the people who are able to do that should be on the front lines. The people who aren't able to do that should find some other ways to be useful to the movement and to the resistance. But, you know, if folks want to go and hold a sign that says free hugs at a Trump rally because they want to show that gay people aren't bad, you know, that's great for them. I really hope that they don't get hurt. But when they go and they get hurt, they can keep doing that as many times as they want to. It won't change anybody's minds. Because what we saw the entire campaign was, you know, love trumps hate. Blah, blah, blah. Peace, love, peaceful protest, etc., etc. You know, we saw the sort of neoliberal, nonviolent tactics of, well, if you just reason with the racists, they'll stop being racist. You know, if you just tell the Islamophobes, hey, that's really Islamophobic, they'll be like, aw, shit. You know, you're right. I do hate Muslims, and that's wrong. And then they'll stop being bigots. That's not how it works. You know, you can't educate every bigot back into solidarity with the people that they were previously oppressing. That's not how it works. And we're certainly not going to be able to educate Donald Trump into respecting people, because he's not going to respect people. And he doesn't respect people, and he's already actively encouraged violence against our communities. And, you know, what do you do in the face of violence? Do you sit down and take it, or do you ask it nicely to stop with a flower and a sign? Or do you fight back? And I say you fight back. You know, we saw what happened in the 60s and the 70s when you know, people were having peaceful protests against the war in Vietnam, and, you know, the National Guard came and shot up a whole bunch of students at Kent State. Peaceful protest, when opposing fascism, doesn't work. Sure, it's fine for neoliberalism if you want to peacefully protest against a government that pretends to respect you, but really just has all these shadow mechanisms for taking away your rights. That's more effective, because then you're competing for the same moral high ground. And if you can occupy that moral high ground better than they can, then you're able to say, well, wait, look at all these things that you say that you're doing that you're not actually doing. What the fuck? But when you're opposing fascists and neo-Nazis and Klansmen, you're not competing for a moral high ground with them. Their moral high ground is completely different than yours. Their moral high ground is a world in which you don't exist. And if you're trying to occupy the moral high ground of, I won't fight back against these people because fighting back is wrong and violence is wrong, and I will show them that I'm a peaceful, civilized person, well then, cool. Like, that's awesome if that's the strategy that you choose to employ. But when you compete for a moral high ground with somebody who's not interested in your moral high ground, you won't get very far. And you will get really badly hurt in the process, because their morality and your morality are completely incompatible. And, you know, make them so afraid that their morality seems too dangerous for them to practice, because that's what they're trying to do to us. And we cannot and will not take it sitting down. You know, to liberal white folks who think that we should all just give Donald Trump a chance, or who think, you know, now we just have to sit back and let him govern and oppose him legislatively, or, you know, other kinds of do-nothingness, I would ask, will you show up to our protests and stand in front of us so that we don't get shot with your peaceful legislation and your giving Donald Trump a chance? Because we already don't see you in Standing Rock. We already don't see you at Black Lives Matter protests. We already don't see you, you know, stopping ICE from deporting undocumented people. We already don't see you forming protective human barriers around mosques when people come and, like, mock and berate Muslim folks on their way to worship. So will you show up now and nicely ask the mob of Klansmen to not kill us? Or will you stay home and say, you should reason with the Klansmen? I'm sure they're very nice people. Now is not the time for liberal moderation. Now is not the time to sit back and do nothing and let the system work things out. Now is the time to take the rage and disappointment that you feel that Donald Trump got elected, get your ass into the street and do something about it. Because, if Aunt Becky sits home and writes a Facebook post about how sad she is about Donald Trump and doesn't do anything when her lesbian niece is getting beaten up for being a lesbian, then Aunt Becky fucking sucks and is just as bad as the people beating up her niece because she's not doing anything to stop the violence that she knows is happening. So show up. Fuck Trump.